everyone. I'm Kim Coghill with ACA International in the Washington, D.C. office. ACA is the leading voice for the accounts receivable management industry. The content provided in this podcast is presented for educational and general reference purposes only. The content is not intended to serve as legal advice. So before we get started on today's podcast, which is a follow-up to a recent House Financial Services Committee hearing on debt collection, I just want to remind you that registration is open for ACA International's Fall Forum and Expo, November 6th through 8th in Chicago at the Drake. For more information on it, please visit our website at www.acainternational.org. So back to today's podcast featuring ACA International Vice President and Senior Counsel Leah Dempsey, who will moderate a discussion with ACA International member John Bedard, owner of the Bedard Law Group in Atlanta, and Sarah Auchterlonie, an ACA consultant and shareholder at Brownstein Hyatt Farber Schreck in Denver. So John and Sarah recently testified on behalf of the industry last month before the House Committee chaired by U.S. Representative Maxine Waters. So at this time, I'll turn it over to Leah.
Thanks, Kim, and I'm very pleased to be here this afternoon with Sarah and John. Before we get started, I thought it might be helpful to provide a little bit of a background of how this hearing came about. Last spring, Chairwoman Waters announced that they would be holding a hearing, and it would be entitled Examining Legislation to Protect Consumers and Small Business Owners from Abusive Debt Collection Practices. Obviously, that title is a bit provocative, and ACA realized that we may have some work to do to educate the committee further about the industry. As luck would have it, the agenda over the summer was pretty busy, and that hearing ended up getting pushed until September. So it gave us some additional time to meet with many members of the House Financial Services Committee and actually launch a grassroots advocacy campaign through ACA to allow members to directly weigh in with Congress. The hearing was eventually rescheduled for September 26th, which happened to fall just a week after the comment period deadline for the CFPB debt collection rule, making for a very hectic September. ACA's comment, which Sarah helped lead, was 154 pages. So you can imagine finishing that up and preparing for the hearing all in 1 month was quite a feat. So that's kind of the background of where we got to where we are. John and Sarah both were witnesses at the hearing. So I think right now might be an appropriate time to turn it over to them to give us some of their high-level thoughts on what it was like to be in the hot seat and to be witnesses at the hearing. So maybe we'll start with Sarah, and then John, you can jump in as well.
Well, first of all, Leah, I wanted to say thank you for the opportunity to allow me to represent the industry in Congress. It was a great experience, as well as working on the comment for the CFPB. I had the opportunity to learn, by working with everyone over the summer, how important the ARM industry is, not just to creditors and making sure that credit's available to consumers, but also to the families who work in the ARM industry as well as our entire economy. What I found when I was there sitting in the chamber with the members of Congress across from me is that, many of them understood that as well. I got a lot of positive feedback, nods, positive body language when we talked about how important it was for creditors and for, the small businesses in our communities. Their accounts were collected by professionals in a timely manner. A lot of members of Congress themselves were small business people, or they had even been lenders or creditors at some point in time. And so I think that they had a lot of personal experience that is relevant and relatable to the ARM industry. And I was very surprised and pleased to have that sort of engagement with them.
John, any high-level thoughts on your end about the hearing?
Yes, and so thank you. That was an experience that I've never had before. I've not ever testified before Congress, and so it did give me a little bit of anxiety and a little bit of excitement all at the same time. And so that's how I can describe a little bit how I felt when I was there. But one of the things that really resonates with me is if the collection industry does not educate lawmakers on our business and our plight and our story, then nobody will. Nobody will, because I felt like there was nobody else in that chamber that understood our story, that understood our positions, in the absence of somebody from the industry being there explaining that to these lawmakers. And just like Sarah said, there were small business owners there that we were talking to, that were lawmakers, and that understood what we were saying. But there were also a great many of those lawmakers that never before experienced being owed a debt and not being able to collect it and needing help collecting it. It was one of the lawmakers, I remember, asked the panel to raise their hand if they had ever been responsible for a payroll or ever had an employee or ever had a business in which they had to make ends meet. And Sarah, I think you and I may have been the only people that raised our hand on that panel. There may have been one other. And so that really resonated with me, and it communicated to me that there were some lawmakers that really understood what we do and how we do it and why we do it.
Thanks, John. And I agree. I think both you and Sarah made great points that there was understanding from House Financial Services Committee members about the work of the industry. Both of you really brought an important message that represented the views of the entire membership. Leading up to the hearing, there was a lot of stuff circulating in both the press and also on Capitol Hill that I think contained some misinformation about the industry. A lot of the press painted an unfair picture of the rule, saying things like it was opening the floodgates to abusive communication practices from the industry. Sarah, as the author of ACA's comments to the CFPB, do you think the hearing presented any opportunities to clarify for Congress, maybe some of the points we made in our comment letter and other points on behalf of the industry to help provide some clarity on some of that misinformation?
I feel like we got a lot of opportunity at the hearing to be really straightforward with the committee about all of the misinformation that had been circulating on the Hill. And in fact, I feel like I had some good eye contact with some of the people who might have been surprised by what we had to say about it. So a few points. First of all, one of the representatives got the chance to ask how long the CFPB's rule had been in the process. Able to clarify that it has been in the works for several years and that the people working on it were career government employees, hopefully to the point that we didn't believe that it was watered down by any means because of the fact that the current director was not appointed by a Democratic president. One of the particular issues that we talked about was the limited content message. And we got the chance to explain how essential it was in order to clear up what was really a confusing situation in the court and with the ambiguity in the FDCPA. Ranking Minority Member McHenry understood, really right away and sort of instinctively that, once we can clear up the voicemail conundrum, we really have an opportunity to reduce the number of telephone calls that go out to consumers where we end up having to hang up and not leave a message just because of the legal uncertainty right now. So I think that went a long way to sort of dispel the notion that calls would be increasing and not decreasing. We also got a chance to talk about how the call caps issue or the safe harbor for 7 calls a day was actually the first numerical imposition that existed in the law, and that up until that point there was no number established. And so any statements otherwise would be completely contrary to fact. We got a good chance to really dispel some of those strange rumors that have been floating around. John, maybe you have some more things you can add.
I think there was a misunderstanding that you clarified, Sarah, about the communication channels that the Bureau proposes to create rules of the road on, particularly email and text messages. And there were some representatives that I think mistakenly believed that the rule allowed debt collectors to engage in an unlimited volume of communications to a consumer using those channels. And I think we did a good job of explaining that not only does the rule not allow that, but the rule actually gives consumers control over whether or not debt collectors use those communication channels at all.
Oh, indeed. And John, I think you even used the term unprecedented amounts of control. you were really powerful on that point. So I think that idea got through.
John, I know one of the important points that you made to Congress was your concern about some of the ongoing CFPB enforcement actions. Can you talk a little bit about what you shared with the committee there and how that was received?
I thought it was important for that committee to know that regulation by enforcement is wrong, that it's unlawful, and that it has to stop. It's still going on, in my view. And there were representatives there that understood that very issue. I made it a point to explain that the proper way of governing the industry is to first make rules and then enforce those rules, and not do what the Bureau has had a history of doing, which is to enforce the rules that they wish existed for the purposes of creating consent orders and examples of people in the marketplace that they then parade around the market as a warning to everybody else. That's just not the way law should be made. There were some representatives that actually repeated what I had said and expressed their own concern about that and agreed. Another representative actually, asked me to provide some examples, and I actually learned a lot about how these hearings work, which is that when they're at a time, so are you, and so I didn't really get an opportunity to fully answer that question about going through the litany of examples that are out there. But nonetheless, I do think that we made the point loud and clear that regulation by enforcement is wrong, that it's still happening, and that it needs to stop.
I think those are important points. And Sarah, I know as a former Bureau employee, that came up several times at the hearing. You were actually in the enforcement division. Any thoughts on any of the discussion that occurred surrounding that?
Yeah, I think that having the CFPB experience was helpful in some of those points, particularly towards the end when I started getting picked on a little bit. I had the opportunity to point out that a misconception that calling a person's relatives or friends or, other contacts, embarrassing them for the debt collection purposes was not actually allowed under the FDCPA. And this member of Congress, I think, was operating under the impression from a television show that this was something that collection agencies actually did on a regular basis. Being a former enforcement official, it was easy for me to stay, and I felt comfortable saying, no, you're absolutely wrong. This is illegal. I've personally looked into such issues and would consider them illegal. That is a role for enforcement. It's not a role for further invasive lawmaking. And having that sort of background, I think, became a little more helpful in those situations.
Yeah, I think you made one key point there when you mentioned that one member of Congress was operating from facts gleaned from a television show. I think that says a lot about some of the problems with, the information flow up there, and why we were so thankful to have both you and John, who are really experts in this area, able to really discuss what the law actually says and how it's actually applied in real life. Another thing I was happy to see from several members of Congress, specifically Congressman Lukemeyer and Congressman Roger Williams, just two I'm thinking of off the top of my head, they really spoke to their direct experience about how debt collection impacted their work. Congressman Lukemeyer, I think everyone probably knows, was a longtime community banker and provided some examples of when he relied on the industry. Congressman Roger Williams was in the auto industry and did the same. He provided some specific examples. So I think overall there was several good questions about how the industry impacts the economy in general, and just wondering any thoughts you all have on that coming up in the hearing and how you were able to address that.
Hopefully we had the opportunity to get through to some members on both sides of the aisle to explain to them that the communication aspect of debt collection is so important to consumers, not just the collection industry, because a lot of times the collection industry are the people that have the relevant information about the account, about how to go back and talk to the creditor, particularly since so much of the collection industry is comprised of medical debt. A lot of times the first pieces of information you get about exactly what you owe comes from that collection call. And so I think that with the help of those two congressmen talking about their viewpoint, we can also layer in the importance of communication from everyone's perspective. And I'm hoping that maybe softens some hearts on the other side of the aisle as well when it comes to how important the collection industry is.
I agree 100% with Sarah. There were many representatives that listened. There were many representatives that understood. And there were a handful of representatives that not only understood but shared their own experiences as business owners in very much need of the kind of services that the industry provides. And so it was encouraging to hear that, especially from the people who make the rules.
John, one thing that a lot of our viewers may not understand, and it wouldn't have been obvious at all because of how expertly you testified and how great of a job you did, is that you were actually added as a witness just a few days before the hearing. As I already mentioned, September was a hectic month with filing the comments, preparing for the hearing, and then adding on top of that your sort of surprise testimony. Anything you can share about that experience and how it all came together?
I didn't receive my invitation to testify until Tuesday evening. I was in very close communication with you about that, and the next morning I was on a plane to D.C. I arrived early in the afternoon, and then you and I and Sarah and the great folks over at the Brownstein firm, we ended up preparing testimony for the remainder of the day into the evening, and then lo and behold, I didn't sleep very much that night. The next morning we get up and bang, you're in the hot seat. And so it was a bit of a whirlwind there for about 48 hours or a little bit less than that. But nonetheless, we really did a great job preparing and putting our testimony together, thanks in no small part to you, Leah, because you really orchestrated my preparation, and anybody that has an opportunity to work with Sarah and her colleagues over at the Brownstein firm really will have a lot to learn from that, because they really are top-notch over there, and I learned a great deal from my short time in D.C. with them, and I'm very grateful to have been able to prepare with them. Like I said early on, this was a first-time experience for me, and I'm glad I did it, and I did the best I could under the circumstances, and I'm very grateful to have had that opportunity, and I think we really did make an impact on the lawmakers that wanted to hear what we had to say.
Yeah, John, I really can't thank you enough on behalf of ACA International for your flexibility and coming to testify on such short notice. I really heard a lot of great feedback from the entire industry on both of your testimonies, and we really appreciate it because we know it's not an easy thing to do under normal circumstances, let alone under kind of the extreme circumstances that you were in. So again, we're all really thankful to both of you, and specifically John, because of your time crunch. Overall, just in your experience at the committee, was there anything else that sort of surprised you or any other big takeaways that you think might be helpful for ACA members to be aware of?
I learned a great deal about how sort of Congress works because I was starting from a baseline of almost nothing. And there were lawmakers that were sitting in front of us that were interested, that listened, that appeared to be concerned, and that even indeed were passionate about the issues that the committee was undertaking and had some pretty good and deep understanding about what was happening in the marketplace and what was happening before the committee. I also observed, however, lawmakers at the diametrically opposed opposite side of the spectrum that I felt were disconnected, that really did not have an understanding of what happens in the marketplace and the real need for our industry and the good people that are in our industry. And I also felt that there were some lawmakers there that were less inclined to be even listening to what we were saying and more interested in themselves making statements about the way they thought the the world was. At first, I was a bit surprised by that, but now that I've had some days to reflect on it, it sort of becomes a little bit more clear to me that sometimes lawmakers have their own reasons for coming to meetings like that and saying the things that they say in a very public way, notwithstanding that they had a panel of experts there in front of them to help inform them about the right decisions to make, when really I sort of felt like some of those lawmakers had their decisions made, and it wasn't really about us informing them, but them sort of telling us the way they thought it was. I hadn't really observed or experienced that before, but that's sort of one of my takeaways there. Another takeaway that I've got from this experience is that the work the industry does on Capitol Hill is so very much more important than I ever thought it was. If we don't tell our story, nobody will. And nobody is better than people in the industry to tell our story, which is what we did there. And I think we did a real good job. So those are my two real takeaways from this experience, Leah.
I couldn't agree more with John. I had very similar reactions to what I was able to observe. I was also struck by the idea that if you are out and about and have the opportunity to invite your House member or even senator to come visit your call center or your facility or your business and see how you go about doing your work and giving them some on-site opportunity. Every time I've been on-site at a collection agency, I've always been impressed, and it's always added to my understanding of how things really work. And I think those types of experiences could be really powerful for these group of people.
Thank you both for those thoughts. Couldn't agree with both of you more that it's of the utmost importance that Congress hears about what's actually happening in the industry from people that are doing this work every day. I think often when they're writing these bombastic press releases and making other accusations against industry participants, they're really not connecting to the fact that these are their constituents. These are people that are employed in their districts that are trying to provide a service and work with consumers to help resolve their debts. Both of you had a huge impact on getting that message to Congress about the important work of the industry, and we really can't thank you enough. ACA, as we kind of move forward, this was a very positive step forward, but we're not done. The rule is not final yet. It's far from final. The CFPB is going to be working on this for several months ahead, and we know that Congress is going to continue to scrutinize the work of the industry. In fact, Kathy Kreninger will be testifying several times this month on Capitol Hill, and we think that the work of the debt collection industry will very likely come up again. So we all need to continue to advocate on Capitol Hill.
Okay, thanks so much, everyone, for a fantastic podcast full of great information. Before we close, I'd like to remind everyone that news and information related to the accounts receivable management industry is covered extensively in Collector Magazine and in ACA's daily electronic newsletter, both of which are available on our website at www.acainternational.org. This podcast and ACA's other podcasts are available on ACA's website or wherever you normally listen to podcasts. Thank you all and have a great day.